Hi everyone, so this is your mini lecture on knowledge skepticism. Okay, so this chapter primarily focuses on epistemology. And epistemology is the study of knowledge. Okay. So you might wonder why we're even talking about epistemology in this class. Well, it's because it turns out it's a really tricky thing to figure out what knowledge is exactly. Typically, we think we know lots of things, right? It seems like I know that I'm recording something right now. It seems as though I know that my car is outside. It seems as though I know what my birthday is. Okay. But what's it mean to know something? That's what we're going to be focusing on for most of this chapter. And various theories we're going to look at, in particular, we're looking at two theories, rationalism and empiricism. They have differing ways of approaching the question of what it means to know something and how you can come to know things. Now, this is all, of course, assuming that you can't know anything at all. Some theories of knowledge actually say that you can't know anything, right? And this would seem to have some pretty big consequences if we could not know anything, right? Um, so, for example, there might be various ethical consequences, right? So, you know, so if I cannot know so for example, so if skepticism is true, that would mean that I can't know anything. Okay, this is a preview of coming attractions, but skepticism is really just the view you can't know anything at all, right? Um, but if I can't know anything, then you might wonder how it is I could be responsible for things, right? Because typically we think people are morally responsible for things only if they actually know what they're doing, right? But if I can't know what I'm doing, if I can't know anything, then it might seem like I can never be morally responsible for anything. Okay, not just morally responsible, legally responsible as well. Um, Nonetheless, though, the question of what we can know, what we do know, and if we know anything at all, are quite contentious, and they might have some pretty not just big impacts on ethics, but just in general, right? Because again, it seems like I know that my car's outside, right? And it would seem almost like to shake the foundations of just my life really if I didn't even know that my car was outside, right? Or at least that, maybe it got towed away or something or for whatever reason. But at least I remember, parking my car there and assuming I don't get towed, right? I should know that my car is outside. Okay. Or if I couldn't even know that I'm recording something right now, that seems kind of crazy. Okay. But when we're talking about what we do know, we're focusing on something called propositional knowledge. So propositional knowledge is knowledge of a proposition or knowing that something is the case. Propositions are just kind of a fancy way of saying um, a statement, kind of, but not quite. You can sort of think of propositions as a kind of statement. So remember, statements are just assertions, right? So the sky is blue is a statement. That's not to be confused with a sentence. Sentences can be statements, but sentences aren't like the object of knowledge, right? We just don't know sentences. We know all sorts of things, right? So propositions are a lot more general than just sentences, and kind of more general than just statements as well. But whatever propositions are, you can sort of think of them as like the things that we know out in the world, okay? Because again, it's not just sentences, not just like things that people tell us, right? We know about objects, we know about things about people, okay? Um, so propositions could be varied, right? Now, with that in mind, there's sorry, give me 1 second here. Okay. Um, with that in mind, there's a question of like what sort of a traditional idea of what knowledge is to begin with. Okay. Um, at the first pass, you might think knowledge just seems like a true belief, right? So it seems like I know that I'm recording something right now. Well, what's it mean to say that I know that I'm recording right now? Well, it's to say that I have like a true belief, maybe, that I'm recording right now. That seems right, right? Well, it's true that I'm recording, right? And I believe it, right? Or suppose, you're trying to figure out what it means to know that your birthday is on such and such a day. Okay, so my birthday is in December, for instance. So it seems as though I can say that I know that my birthday is in December. Well, what would it mean for me to know that my birthday is in December? Well, it would mean it seems like that I have a true belief that my birthday is in December. Okay. Unfortunately, this idea of knowledge has a big problem, and the main problem has to do with lucky guesses, right? So, um, the fact that whatever you know has to be true, that sounds right, right? It doesn't sound like you can know something that's false. That almost sounds contradictory, right? Because if something was false, you wouldn't know it, right? So, you know, it's false that the Earth, or excuse me, that the sun revolves around the Earth. That's false. You could never know that the sun revolves around the Earth because the sun doesn't revolve around the Earth. It's false, right? It all seems like knowledge is some kind of belief, right? So, we have beliefs about all sorts of things, right? I believe I'm recording right now. I believe my birthday's in December. I believe that it's kind of dreary outside. Okay. Um, nonetheless, knowledge does seem like a kind of belief, right? But like a qualified kind of belief, a true kind of belief. But the problem with that definition of knowledge is that it leaves open lucky guesses. So, for example, suppose that I had a belief that I have $20 in my pocket. Okay, suppose I have that belief. Now, suppose if I were to reach into my pocket right now and I'll pull out a 20. Okay. Um, but suppose I had no idea that there was a $20 bill in my pocket, right? I was just like, I kind of believe there's a $20 bill in my pocket. Do I have any reason to think it? No. But suppose, like, a long while ago, I put a 20 in there and I never got it out of my pocket. And every time I wash my pants or whatever, I never bothered to take it out. And I forgot about it. And I just had this belief that I had $20 in my pocket. And again, it was just a guess, right? It would seem like, I didn't actually know that there was $20 in my pocket because it was just like a lucky guess, right? Maybe a different example. Suppose I buy a lottery ticket, okay, and I'm like, I believe that I'm going to win the lottery, okay. So I have a belief that I'm going to win the lottery. Suppose I do win the lottery. Well, it's a true belief that I won the lottery. But did I know that I was going to win the lottery? I don't think anyone would say I was going to know that I was going to win the lottery, right? Again, I might have believed it and it might have ended up being true, but I didn't know in any interesting sense that I was going to win the lottery. Okay. So it seems like for these sorts of considerations, primarily lucky guesses, that knowledge can't just be true belief. But in particular, what it's missing is this component of justification, right? So with the $20 in my pocket, I didn't have any reason to think that there was $20 in my pocket. I just thought it. Okay. With my lottery ticket, I did not have a good reason to think I was going to win, right? So, like, depending on what the lottery was, the chances of me winning were really, 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 really small. In fact, it seemed like I kind of knew almost in a way that, like, I wasn't going to win the lottery. And if I did actually, in fact, not win the lottery, then it seems like I would have kind of known that. But anyway, the idea is that, like, typically knowledge has this justification component that you sort of tack on to true beliefs. And knowledge is just that. It's a justified true belief, right? And that seems to fix the problem of lucky guesses, because if you make a lucky guess, guesses, and lucky guesses in particular, typically aren't justified, right? You might think, well, maybe what about like educated guesses? Educated guesses might be different, because the idea is that, like, so if I make an educated guess on, suppose I'm doing like a really complicated math problem. I'm like, look, I don't want to work this whole thing, but I have a kind of a good sense of what it is, and I write down an answer or whatever. I might have some justification for thinking that's right, because, like, maybe I have a good background in math or whatever. Okay. So knowledge traditionally is thought of as a justified true belief in something. Okay. So the question that we're going to be focusing on in this class is, one, whether we can even have justified true beliefs. And if we can't, we're committed to skepticism. And if we can, how it is that we justify our beliefs and how we come about getting true beliefs. Okay. Before I get to that, though, there's an important distinction I want to make between two general kinds of knowledge, right? So there's something called a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. Okay. A priori knowledge is a kind of knowledge gained independently of or prior to someone's experience. Okay. So The idea with a priori knowledge is something that it's knowledge that you can have without relating or not without relying on sense experience is the idea. So, for example, I might come to know that 1 plus 1 equals 2. But the fact I know that 1 plus 1 equals 2 has nothing to do about my various sorts of sense experience I might have had. Okay. I don't need to, I didn't like encounter the number 1 out in the wild and I didn't see it get added to a number 1 to make 2. That's not how numbers work or how math works, right? You come to learn that 1 plus 1 equals 2 entirely independent of like the sorts of things you see out in the world, right? You can just sort of like sit down in a chair and think about it and realize that 1 plus 1 equals 2, okay? Or for instance, another kind of a priori knowledge might be something like, suppose I told you that, so remember valid arguments from maybe the first day of class? So valid arguments are arguments where if all the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true, okay? And we might come to have a priori knowledge that various sorts of arguments are true, or excuse me, are valid. And the reason why is because you can figure out whether an argument's valid just by thinking about the argument. You don't need to rely on your sense experience to realize that an argument's valid. Now you might wonder, well, wait a minute. With the 1 plus 1 equaling 2 example and the argument example, you might think, but didn't I need someone to tell me what validity is and someone to tell me what 1 plus 1 is? And doesn't the fact that when I hear someone tell me these things, isn't that kind of a sense experience? Well, no, not in the sense that we're talking about right now. The idea is that a priori knowledge, right? The question about knowledge is what's the main way you sort of come about knowing this thing, right? So, sure, someone might have told you that 1 plus 1 equals 2, but what justifies it isn't that someone told you, it's that that's just the way how 1 and adding works, right? If someone told you 2 plus 2 equals 5, right, that would be false and you couldn't know that, right? Because you can't know things that are false, right? The idea is that what justifies that kind of knowledge, what primarily supports it, is stuff besides your sense experience, okay? Or the thing about valid arguments, right? You don't need to go out and look with a microscope or look out in the world to figure out whether an argument's valid or not, right? What makes it valid or not is just thinking about it, basically. Okay. So we're going to get to some examples of a priori knowledge a little later and in class, but to contrast a priori knowledge, there's something called a posteriori knowledge. That's knowledge that depends entirely on sense experience. So, for instance, the fact that apples are red is a kind of a posteriori knowledge, right? The only way I could come about getting that knowledge is by seeing a red apple, right? And by seeing the apple, my sight, right? It's a sense experience, right? That's what gives me justification for thinking that apples are red, right? I can't just sit down in a chair and come to a conclusion without seeing an apple that an apple is red, right? I need to actually see that an apple is red, all right, to know that it's red, okay? Or, to know that like any sort of scientific knowledge typically is a posteriori knowledge, because typically scientific knowledge is empirical, and empirical stuff is the sort of stuff that you get from your sense experience. Whereas a priori knowledge, you might think mathematical knowledge typically is a kind of a priori knowledge is the idea, right? This is all stuff you do not need your sense experiences to know, right? So, if I was blind and I was deaf, right, I can still do mathematics. Doesn't matter, okay? All right. So there's two broad camps, like I said, for those who think that we can have knowledge. The main question they're focusing on is how it is we come about knowing things. Like, what gives us justification for knowing these things, and what can we know at all to begin with, okay? So there's two broad camps. One's the rationalist camp, one's the empiricist camp. So rationalists think that we come to know things based on reason, basically, and reason alone, right? We can come to learn truths about the world just by reasoning about things. That's what rationalists think. Empiricists think that we come to know things just by sense experience alone. Okay. So notice the distinction between the two. Rationalists say, look, yes, we can know things. We can have justified true beliefs about things. How do we get that justification? It's all through reasoning. It's not based on sense experience. So there's a distinction between the rationalists and empiricists, that rationalists put all their emphasis on reason. They do not think, typically they never usually think you can actually know stuff via the senses, which is quite interesting because typically we think like, look, well, I might see my hand in front of me, right? I'm sensing that my hand's in front of me. Isn't that giving me knowledge that my hand's in front of me? Rationalists would actually say, well, it's not your sense experience that's giving you justification for thinking your hand's in front of you. It's going to somehow have to be unaided reason. And when we look at Descartes in class, we'll get a good sense of what that looks like and how rationalists actually try to justify what seems to be sort of things that really are dependent upon our sense experience. Okay. On the flip side, though, empiricists have like a kind of different problem, right? So empiricists, they can explain really easily how it seems to be that I can know that my hand's in front of me, right? Because I can sense it, right? I can see it in front of me. But they might have a bit of a hard time explaining how it is we come to know like mathematical truths, for instance, right? So again, it's not as though like we went out into the world and figured out these really complicated math problems that mathematicians are dealing with all the time, but we had to really think them through, right? And we think them through, we came up with various formulas and axioms, and we built up systems from that, and then we sort of got like, algebra and calculus and stuff like that, right? And the idea is that like, well, that wasn't like, we didn't come to know those things based on like looking out in the world or anything like that, right? I didn't need to I didn't just like look out in the world and see like calculus, right? You got to think about it, right? So empiricists kind of have a slightly different problem than rationalists. And we'll see David Hume kind of doing this. He's an empiricist generally, but he thinks that if you're too much of an empiricist, you end up being a skeptic, actually. So we'll look at David Hume as a kind of empiricist, and John Locke. John Locke's more of a hardcore empiricist, and he'll help us understand how it is that we can come to know things via sense experience. Okay, but again, the two main camps we're looking at are rationalist and empiricist. Now, the third camp we're going to look at actually denies that we can know anything at all. And contrary to your book kind of presents this a bit differently. I don't want to talk about the distinctions that they're making. I don't think they're necessary for this class. So we're going to say that skepticism is just the view that we can't know anything at all, right? So we'll also see Descartes talk about skepticism, although, again, he's not a skeptic. He's a rationalist. But Descartes really pushes us to consider seriously that if we rely on our sense experiences too much, we're going to be pushed all the way into a skeptical view, and the only way out of this view is to be a rationalist. Okay, so skeptics think we can't know anything at all, and the way that they get to that varies, but typically skeptics think that we can't know anything because it seems like we can never be certain about anything at all. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this mini lecture. Okay, your book talks about relativistic views. We're not going to talk about this for this chapter. Okay, I think we already touched on the interesting stuff in our section on ethics with like cultural relativism and stuff like that, and everything else I don't really want to talk about. So we're going to skip that for now. Okay. So I think typically most people see this and they think, okay, rationalists seem kind of goofy, right? I think a lot of people, if anything, are either empiricists or skeptics. They might kind of think rationalists are a bit on the deep end, and it seems like they might have some trouble with explaining how it is that, how can we even say that we know that our hands are in front of us, right? Because if we can't rely on sense experience, and we're just relying on reason, well, how do I reason to the fact that my hand's in front of me? Well, again, we'll look at Descartes to help us answer that, but there's some reason to think that you should be a rationalist. Okay, so here's some considerations. One is that it might seem like if you think we can know things, right, and a lot of people do, and your choices are rationalism and empiricism, you might question how it is if you're an empiricist, right? So a rationalist can say to an empiricist, look, how could you ever be certain about sense data, right? And here's the thought. So, how is that you actually know you're not dreaming right now, right? can you prove to me with certainty you're not dreaming right now? Like you're just not having a really, really lucid dream at this moment? And it seems like you maybe can't, right? Maybe you're just having like a really, really long dream, right? Or, right, the movie The Matrix, right? In that, one of the people in it, they're in a simulation, right? Can you prove to me that you're not in a simulation? Because if you can't, right, the idea is that like dreams and being in the simulation, the stuff that you sense in dreams and simulations aren't real, right? So if I'm in a simulation, I don't actually know that there's a water bottle in front of me because it's not true there's a water bottle in front of me, right? It's just that there's a simulation that's telling me that. Or if I'm dreaming, right, it's not there's a water bottle in front of me. It's because, I'm just dreaming it, right? So the problem it seems like with our sense perception is that we can never really know for sure whether or not our sense perceptions are accurate, right? What if, think about like various sorts of visual illusions, right? Visual illusions all the time give us reason to doubt our sense experience. So mirages, right? So mirages are a kind of sense illusion. And the idea is that like if we really get knowledge from our senses, you might think, well, wait a minute, couldn't I know that there's a mirage in front of me? Um, but if it's like, of course not, right? Mirages aren't actually real. It's just your eyes tricking you. Okay. But notice you don't get the same problem with reason, right? So when you reason about things, let's just stick with math, for instance. When you reason about mathematics, for instance, you can be certain about your answer. Like, assuming you don't mess anything up, so maybe like you're like, oh, maybe I missed this step here or whatever. But if you got the steps right, you can be certain that your answer is correct, right? There's no room for like, there's no illusions in mathematics. There's no visual illusions in mathematics, right? The fact that you might be dreaming doesn't have any bearing on whether or not like which your mathematics how your math turns out is true or false, right? So reason doesn't have the same sort of problem about like dreaming or illusions or anything like that. Okay. I talked about the second point a little bit already, but the idea was that it seems like mathematical truths don't seem to be based on experience at all. Right. So, for instance, it's just true that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Okay. But lots of people think you don't need to have seen like a million different, instances of 2 points, and you didn't need to like measure out all the points individually to figure that out. Right. You can just reason about it and figure it out on your own. Right. That seems to be true with all sorts of mathematical truths. And if you think that's the case, and you're an empiricist, you have a problem because empiricists think, again, that everything that we know ultimately comes down to sense experience. But it seems like math doesn't work that way. But rationalists can explain it really easily because it all comes down to reason for them. All right. Another reason is that reason seems indispensable to knowledge. It's worth noting right away that doesn't mean that empiricists don't use reason or that like the fact that reason seems indispensable to knowledge is like a knockdown reason to be a rationalist. But it's worth noting that it seems like all the time when we know something, when we have a justification for something, we need to rely on reasons for thinking what we think is right? Because if we can't, then we can't know it, right? And rationalists can explain why that is really easily, because it all comes down to reason and logical thinking for them, right? Okay. Now, why might you be an empiricist? Okay, so here's a separate consideration. Well, empiricists have a really easy time explaining how it is that we can come to know things via experience alone, right? So we already talked about this with like my hand in front of me. And again, with the sciences, right? There's lots of important things we learn from science that are from experience, right? So we couldn't have known just based on pure reason that the Earth rotates around the sun and not vice versa. We need to have actually observed that. A lot of things with medicine, right? It seems like the way we came to know that was because of like experimentation, but experimentation relies upon experience, right? So empiricists seem to have a lot going for them, right? Because it seems like a lot of like the sort of like knowing that my car is out there, right? The fact that I was born in December, right? How do I know that? Well, my parents told me, right? And not just they didn't just tell me, right? But like they told me, and maybe they showed me like a birth certificate, right? And so my eyes saw the birth certificate, and that seemed to give me reason to think that, I was born in December. Okay. You might worry that reason can't take us too far, because again, like I was saying earlier, like how is it that reason can somehow get to the fact that there's a hand in front of me if I put my hand out? Empiricists don't have that problem, right? So you might worry that if you're a rationalist, you can't come to know that many things because it seems like we only know so much from pure reason, and then after that we need to rely on experience in some way, right? Empiricists, however, don't have that issue, right? Because again, like they don't rely purely on reason. They focus primarily on experience. Okay. The main consideration for being a skeptic, there's two main considerations. Both I've already kind of mentioned already. One is that it seems like you never be certain about anything. Again, we'll talk about Descartes when we take a look at this. But it seems like maybe if you push anything at all, you can never be certain about anything, right? So you might think, okay, maybe I can't be certain that my hand's in front of me because maybe I'm dreaming or something. Or maybe I can't be certain the thing on the distance is actually an oasis because maybe it's just a mirage. Okay. You might think though, well, wait a minute, what about like math? Can't I be certain about math and the fact that 1 + 1 = 2? Maybe you even can't do that, right? And Descartes actually pushes this a little bit, right? And again, we'll talk about this in class more, but math might even be a problem if you're a skeptic, or for someone if you're not a skeptic is what I mean to say. Sorry. Another thing is that our senses mislead us all the time, and maybe reason never gets us past definitions. This is something that Hume kind of says. So Hume actually thinks that for math at least, really, all we're doing is just defining things and seeing what follows from definitions, okay? We're not actually saying that something is the case when we make these definitions. We're just saying, like, look, let's just say that, we're just going to define it such that 1 and 1, when you put them together, that they're 2, and we're just going to define it and just say that's how it is. That's kind of how Hume thinks of it, right? And when we do math, all we're doing is just following definitions that we made up, right? It's not that we actually know that there's like a 1, there's like a number out there that we're talking about, and there's like addition thing that we're talking about, and we're putting them together, and then we get 2 or whatever. Okay. And again, our senses mislead us all the time in all sorts of ways, right? So if our senses mislead us all the time, it seems like we can't be certain about them. And if Hume's right about our like mathematics and reason, maybe all we're doing is just defining things and seeing what follows from the definitions. But that's kind of weak in a way. That's sort of like a weak sort of bar for knowledge. Because the idea is like it seems like we want to say that we know true things about the world. We have true beliefs about the world, right? We're not just defining shit and then saying that okay, I'm going to define whatever as whatever, and then just say that, oh, look, so from the fact that I define something this way, I can know it, right? That doesn't seem interesting. It seems like we're actually discovering things when we know something. Okay. So skeptics, their case against knowledge is really difficult to get around. Okay. And we'll see this in more detail in class. But for now, primarily, I want to just get the bigger views out there. Unlike the last the last mini lectures, there isn't any sort of generic arguments for and against rationalism and empiricism. It's going to sort of depend upon the person that we're looking at. So we're going to look at a lot of the arguments primarily in class, and ideally you at least saw the author's explanation of the arguments during the reading. But for now, I just want to get the big picture ideas out there with this little mini lecture. Okay. All right, so I will see you all in class next time.